This is the last will and testament of me, Cuthbert Aldred Ray, of Marrick Hall in the parish of Marrick, in the wapentake of Gilling West in the North Riding of the county of York. Being of sound and disposing mind and memory, though weak in the body, made this 9th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1817. I give and devise unto Frances Standish, spinster, only surviving child of the Reverend Edmund Standish, late of Ripon, deceased, who was the only son of my late father's brother, and who is therefore my first cousin once removed and the last of my blood living upon this earth. All that my capital messuage and mansion house called Marrick Hall, with the home farm, the 2 lower closes, the high pasture upon the fell, the walled garden, the fish ponds, the mill, and all outbuildings thereto belonging, together with the observatory tower and every instrument, glass, clock, chart, and paper contained therein, to have and to hold unto her and her heirs forever. And I give unto the said Frances Standish the sum of £4,000 now standing in the 3% consolidated annuities, and all my books, and my mother's plate, and the portrait of my father that hangs above the South Library chimney-piece. And it is my particular wish, which I lay upon her, not as a command, but as the asking of a dead man who never in his life asked anything of her, that she keep the tower whole and the great glass covered against the damp, and that she look through it, if the gift is in her, as I am persuaded from what has lately come to me that it is. Those words were read aloud in a schoolroom in Richmond, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, upon a wet Thursday afternoon in the last week of March, in the year 1818, by an elderly solicitor, who had ridden the better part of 2 days to read them, and they were heard by a young woman who had never in her 26 years heard the name Cuthbert Ray spoken once. Not by her father while he lived, not by her mother, not by any soul of her acquaintance. Frances Standish sat with her hands folded upon the deal table, at which she had that same morning heard 3 children construe their Latin. And she did not weep, and she did not cry out, and she did not reach for the arm of the chair as a woman is expected to do when she is told that a fortune has fallen upon her out of a clear sky. She listened to the whole of it to the end. And when the solicitor had finished and had laid the parchment down and had taken off his spectacles to wipe them, she asked him the one question that was uppermost in her mind, which was not what a manor house was worth, nor what £4,000 in the funds would yield her by the year, but this. Frances Standish was 26 that spring, of middle height, with brown hair of no remarkable color drawn back and pinned without ornament, a wide clear forehead, and gray eyes that had a way of settling upon a thing and holding it, as though she were taking its measure against some private rule of her own before she would consent to speak of it. She wore the plum and gray stuff gown of a governess in a good house, mended at one cuff so neatly that the mending was itself a kind of accomplishment, and at her throat a thin ribbon and no jewel, for she had none. She had been 4 years governess to the 3 younger children of Miss and Mrs. Ivison of Frenchgate in Richmond, a wool merchant and his wife, who used her well enough and paid her £28 by the year. And before that she had been companion to an elderly lady in Ripon who had died. And before that she had kept her father's house until the fever took him in the same fortnight it took her mother, when Frances was but 19, and left her with a black gown, a brass spyglass that had been her father's, a folding paper star map of her mother's that unrolled to the width of a tea-tray, and no living relation that she knew of anywhere in the world. That last she had believed to the very hour that Mr. Locksley of Richmond had knocked, and so the question she asked him, having heard that a man of her own name and blood had lived out his whole life not 40 miles from where she sat and had died without her once being told he breathed, was level, and went straight to the sore place. "Sir," she said, "you have told me that this gentleman was my father's cousin, and that he is the last of my kin, and that he had known of me and made inquiry after me. Then I must ask you why, in 26 years, no one told me he was alive. My father is these 7 years dead and could not have hidden him from me on purpose so long. Did this Mr. Ray know that I was living, and where, and yet never in all that time send me so much as a line?" Mr. Locksley put his spectacles back upon his nose and looked at her a moment with an expression she could not read, and then he answered her honestly, which she came in time to know was his way in all things. He was a spare, upright man of 63, a Richmond attorney of long standing in plain black superfine, with attentive gray eyes and a manner that neither hurried nor idled. "Miss Standish," he said, "I will answer you as plainly as you have asked, for I think you are a person who would rather have the plain thing than the comfortable one. Mr. Ray did not know of you until the September just past. He and your grandfather, that is, your father's father and his own father, were brothers who quarreled 40 years ago, and more over a matter of a marriage and a piece of land, and the two branches of the family never after spoke, and each, I believe, supposed the other extinct. Your father took orders and went south and west, and Mr. Ray lived out his years at Marrick with his glasses and his charts, and saw almost no one. He believed himself the last Ray alive. Then in the autumn a thing came to his hand, quite by chance, that told him he was not, and he set me to find you. And I found you in November, and I wrote to him that you were alive and were a governess in Richmond, and he was by then already ill, and he altered his will within the fortnight, and he was dead by the middle of February, and I could not decently come to you with the reading of it until the estate was proved. That is the whole of it, and I am sorry it is not a kinder story, but it is a true one." Frances was silent a while. Outside the schoolroom window, the rain came down the glass in long gray ropes, and the roofs of Richmond ran with it, and somewhere below in the house a door closed and a child's voice was hushed. She was thinking, though the solicitor could not have known it, not of the £4,000, nor of the manor house, but of a thing he had said in passing, which was that a thing had come to Mr. Ray's hand in the autumn that told him he was not the last of his blood. She wished very much to know what that thing had been, and something told her, from the careful way Mr. Locksley had said it, that he knew, and that he was leaving her to ask. She did not ask it then. She asked instead the second question, which was the practical one. "And is there any other," she said, "who might have looked to have this? A man does not commonly leave £4,000 and a hall to a cousin he has never seen if there is a nearer claim standing by. I would rather know now, sir, if there is someone whose expectation I am disappointing, than learn it later from his own mouth." At that Mr. Locksley was silent a moment too long, and Frances, who watched faces as she watched the sky, saw the hesitation and understood that she had touched the very thing he had meant to come to by degrees. "There is a gentleman," he said at last, "an attorney of this town, Mr. Denzil Sturdy, who has already written to me, within a week of the death being known, to say that he acts for a client who believes himself the true heir of Marrick, being descended, he says, of an elder Ray line that went to the American colonies. I do not say his claim is nothing. I say only that it is not yet anything, that he has shown me no proof I can call proof, and that a claim announced within 7 days of a death, before the grass is on the grave, is a claim I have learned in 33 years to look at with both my eyes open. You would do well, Miss Standish, to look at it so also. but do not let it fright you out of your inheritance before you have so much as seen it. Go to Marrick, see what is yours. Let the tower be opened. And when Mr. Sturdy comes, as he will come, let him find you already in possession, and let him deal with me." Francis Standish looked at the old man a long moment, and then, for the first time since he had begun to read, something in her face eased, not to gladness, for it was too strange yet for gladness, but to a kind of settled resolution, as a needle eases at last to the north. "Then I will go and see it," she said. "I will give Mrs. Iveson her month, for she has been fair to me, and I will not leave her children in the lurch, and at the end of April I will go to Marrick and be in possession, as you counsel, and I will have the tower opened. You have said, sir, that my cousin wished me to look through the great glass, if the gift was in me. You may tell me, if you will, and you need not spare my strangeness, how a man who never saw my face in his life came to believe there was any such gift in me at all." And there Mr. Locksley smiled, the first smile she had of him, and he gathered his papers into the leather case and rose, and he said only, "That, Miss Standish, you will find written in the tower, in a better hand than mine, and I think it is his to tell you, and not mine. Open the tower first of all, before the house, before the farm, before you count a single spoon. Open the tower." When he had gone, and the sound of his hired horse had died away down French Gate into the general wash of the rain, Frances did not go directly down to tell the Ivesons what had befallen her. She stood a while at the schoolroom window with the copybooks unmarked before her, and she thought of her father. She thought of him as she had last clearly seen him well, a lean, gentle, learned man in a shabby cassock, standing in the little garden at Ripon, with her mother's spyglass to his eye of a frosty night, showing his one child the rings of Saturn, as though he were showing her a secret that the whole loud daylight world had somehow contrived to overlook. "Look, Francis," he had said, "there is a thing that was turning so before ever there was an England, and will be turning so when the last of us is clean forgot. And if that does not quiet a troubled mind, I do not know what shall." He had never once told her that he had a cousin who kept a great glass in a tower in Swaldale, and who did the very thing he did, but grander, and with better instruments, and to purpose. Whether her father had known it and been too proud after the old quarrel to speak of it, or whether he had truly not known, she could not now tell, for he was 7 years in the churchyard at Ripon, and past all asking. But she stood at the window, and she understood, in a way she could not have put into words to Mr. Locksley or to anyone, that the gift the old man in the tower had believed was in her was her father's gift, handed down a line the family had torn in two, and that some thread she had thought cut clean at 19 had after all run on underground the whole time, from her grandfather's brother to a stranger, on a fell 40 miles off, and had come round at the last, past every quarrel, to knock at a schoolroom door. She marked the copybooks then, because the children had earned their marks, and it was not their fault that the world had turned over. And that night, when the house was abed, she took her father's brass spyglass to the cold window of her attic room under the slates, and she found, low over the wet roofs of Richmond in a rent, in the cloud, the steady unwinking point that was the planet Jupiter, and beside it, strung out in their changeless order, the 4 little sparks that Galileo had seen and named, and that she had watched 100 nights of her life without one living soul to tell it to. And she said aloud, softly, to no one, "Well, cousin, I did not know you either. But I know this much, and I will come and see your tower." Mrs. Iveson took the news as such women do, with a first flush of genuine gladness for the girl who had taught her children well, and then, hard upon it, a shrewd wool merchant's wife's reckoning of how she should be got a new governess before Whitsun. She pressed Frances to stay the month, which Frances had already resolved to do, and she wept a little over the children, who wept a great deal more, and she said, over and again, that she had always known there was quality in Miss Standish. Always. From the first day. Which was not true. For on the first day she had thought her a plain silent thing, and had said so to her husband. But it is the way of the world to remember that it foresaw a fortune. And Frances let her keep the little vanity, for she had been fed under that roof for 4 years, and the debt of bread is not lightly reckoned. The month went as the last month always goes, at once too slow and too swift. She taught her final lessons. She heard the youngest, a round, earnest boy of 7, get through the whole of his multiplication table without a stumble for the first time, and she was foolishly near tears over it, this being the last thing she should ever teach him. She packed her one trunk, which held all that she owned in the world and was not full. 3 gowns, her father's books of navigation and of astronomy with their soft worn corners, the brass spyglass in its bays, her mother's folding star map, a workbox, and a thin-bound volume of her own, of which more must be said in its place. And upon the last Tuesday in April, in the year 1818, Miss Frances Standish, 26, sometime governess, climbed into the Richmond to Reeth carrier's cart in the grey of the morning, and went up Swaldale to take possession of a hall she had never seen, left her by a man she had never met, upon the word of a lawyer she had known 1 month. The way up the dale is not a way a person forgets who has once gone up it in the flush of the year. The carrier's cart followed the river, and the river came down loud and brown from the high moors, and on either hand the fell rose green and grey, laced and relaced by the dry stone walls that ran up impossible slopes to the very skyline, as though the old wallers had meant to fence in the clouds themselves. Curlews went over crying. The little grey villages came and went, Marski and Downholme and Grinton with its wide old church that they call the Cathedral of the Dale, and above them all the fells kept climbing, seamed with the pale scars and the ruined chimneys of the lead mines that had made and were even then unmaking the Dale's hard living. Frances had brought a book and did not read it. She sat with her hands folded and her grey eyes going up and up the fell sides, and she thought that a man might live out a whole life in such a place and see almost no one, and yet not be lonely, if he had the sky. Toward the middle of the afternoon the carrier put her down at the foot of a lane in the parish of Marrick, and there was Mr. Locksley's clerk waiting with a gig as he had promised, a fresh-faced young man who touched his hat and handed her up and drove her the last mile himself, and it was he who first said the name of the house aloud to her as they came up under a hanging wood of oak just breaking into leaf. "Marrick Hall, Miss Standish," he said. And she looked, and there it was. It was not a great house, as the great houses of the South are great. It was a long, low, grey stone manor of the Dale's own building, with stone-slabbed roofs gone golden green, with lichen and tall clustered chimneys and mullioned windows that gave back the westering light in squares of dull fire. And it stood upon a shelf of the fell above the river, with the wood at its back and the walled garden at its side, and it looked, to Frances's eye, exactly as though it had grown there out of the same grey rock as the walls and the byres, and would in the end go back into it, unhurried, in its own time. And above the eastern end of it, set a little apart, and joined to the house by a covered stone passage, rose the tower. She had known there was a tower. Mr. Locksley had said the word a dozen times, but she had pictured, without knowing she pictured it, some slight ornamental thing. A folly, a gazebo grown tall. This was no folly. It was a squat, immensely solid round tower of dressed stone, 3 stories and more, wider at the foot than the top, and it was capped not with the ordinary pointed slates of the country, but with a great pale dome, a hemisphere of lead-covered timber that sat upon the stonework like the crown of a bald head, and in the side of the dome, facing south and west toward the open sky above the fell, there was a long shuttered slot, closed now, that a person did not need to be told the use of who had ever in her life stood at a window with a glass to her eye and wished the roof away. Frances Standish looked up at that dome and that closed shutter, and her breath went out of her slowly, and the young clerk, glancing at her, saw her face and had the good sense to say nothing at all, and drove her up the last of the lane in silence to the gravel sweep before the door, where the household of Marrick Hall was drawn up to receive its new mistress. There were not many of them, for it had been a bachelor's spare establishment these 30 years, but they were all there and all in their best. The housekeeper stepped forward first, a straight-backed woman near 60 in gray stuff and a white cap, with keys at her waist, and a face that had kept its own counsel a long time. Mrs. Hibbert. "If you please, ma'am," she said, and dropped a curtsy that was correct to the inch and gave nothing away. Behind her stood the steward, Mr. Pendle, a weathered, plain-spoken man of 50 who ran the home farm and the mill and touched his forehead to her, and old Skelton the butler, who had been 35 years in the house and looked at the new young mistress with pale eyes that had seen everything come and go, and 2 maids and a boy and a cook. And that was the whole of it. Frances got down from the gig and stood before them on the gravel in her plum and gray traveling gown and her one good bonnet, and she was aware, as any woman in her place must be aware, of the strangeness of it, that all these people who had served the old man his whole life were now hers to answer for, and that they were measuring her, kindly enough, but thoroughly, as country servants measure a stranger set suddenly over them. She did not make them a speech. She had thought, on the cart, that she ought perhaps to make them a speech, and had got as far as composing the first sentence of it, and had then, with good sense, thrown the whole thing away, for she knew that nothing she could say on a gravel sweep in the first 5 minutes would do half so much as a month of not being a fool. So she said only, and plainly, that she was very sensible of the trouble they had taken to receive her, that she came a stranger among them, and knew it, and hoped they would bear with her while she learned the house and its ways, and that she had heard from Mr. Locksley that they had every one of them served her cousin faithfully and long, and that she thanked them for it in his name as well as her own, since he could not. It was not much of a speech, but Mrs. Hibbert's straight back eased by perhaps the width of a hair, and old Skelton inclined his head, and Frances understood that she had at least not begun badly. Then Mrs. Hibbert took her in. They went through a low stone porch into a hall floored with great flags, cool and dim after the bright afternoon, with a broad, shallow oak staircase going up into shadow, and the heads of long dead deer upon the walls, and a smell of wood smoke and beeswax and old stone that Frances breathed in and never afterward forgot, for it was the smell of the first hour of the rest of her life. Mrs. Hibbert named the rooms as they went, correctly and without a wasted word: the great parlor, the little parlor, the dining room with its dark portraits, the south library with the cold hearth and the shrouded shape above it that Frances knew must be the portrait of her cousin's father, her own great-grandfather, waiting under its holland cloth. And Frances went through it all attentively, and said the proper things, and let herself be shown the chamber that had been made ready for her. A good square room over the garden with a tester bed and a press and a writing table set, she noticed at once, in the full light of the south window. But all the while, through every room and every civil word, one half of her mind was going on ahead, up the covered passage at the eastern end, to the shut door at the foot of the tower, and at last, when the tour was near done and they stood again in the flagged hall, she could hold it in no longer, and she turned to the housekeeper and said, as evenly as she could manage, Mrs. Hibbert, there is one room you have not shown me, and it is the one I was charged by my cousin's own will to see before any other. I should like the tower opened, if you please. Now, before the light goes. Mrs. Hibbert looked at her a long moment then, and something moved behind the careful face. Some old grief or old loyalty stirred up, and she said, more slowly than she had said anything yet, Master's tower, ma'am. Aye, he'd have it shut when he took to his bed, and shut it has been since the day he died, and no one up in it but myself of a month to see to the damp, for he made me swear to that, to keep the wet out of the great glass whatever else went undone. I have the key here. She lifted a heavy old key from the ring at her waist, apart from the others, worn bright with handling. It is a deal of stairs, ma'am, and the light's better in the morning for the charts and such, but if you'll see it now, you'll see it now. It is yours. And Frances said, it is not the charts I want the light for. Take me up. They went up the covered passage together, the housekeeper going before with a branch of candles, though the day was not yet gone, for the passage was windowless and the tower stair beyond it wound up into the thickness of the stone, with only arrow slits to light it. Mrs. Hibbert fitted the bright worn key to the low door at the foot, and it turned heavily, and the door swung in upon cold air and a smell Frances knew at once, and would have known blindfold, the smell of brass and oil and old paper and cold clean stone, the smell of instruments kept and cared for. The first floor of the tower was a workroom. Frances stood in the doorway and looked, and did not go in for a moment, only looked. There was a long deal bench under the arrow-slit windows, and upon it, ranged and clipped in their places as a surgeon ranges his tools, were the lesser instruments of the science, 2 smaller telescopes on portable stands, a brass sextant, a repeating circle, a barometer, and 2 thermometers, a clock with a long open pendulum ticking still, for someone had kept it wound, and a rack of eyepieces and colored glasses each in its turned wooden cell. Upon the walls, pinned and framed, were charts, the moon in her quarters, drawn larger than a dinner plate, and finer than any engraving Frances had ever seen, the belts of Jupiter, the ringed shape of Saturn, and one great chart above the bench of a patch of stars she did not at first know, ruled and numbered and annotated in a small, close, upright hand. And on a shelf apart, in a long row, stood the journals, some 36 bound quarto volumes in plain marbled boards, each with a year and a season lettered on the spine in the same close hand, running back, she saw, more than 40 years. Frances went to the shelf as a thirsty person goes to water, and put out her hand, and then drew it back, and said to Mrs. Hibbert, half ashamed of the strength of her own wanting, "May I?" And the old woman said, with something that was nearly gentleness now, "It is all yours, ma'am, every word of it. He'd no one to leave it to but you." But Frances did not take a journal down then. She had seen the stair going on up, and she knew what was above, and she found she wanted to go to it before she read a word, the way a person will go and stand in the presence of a great thing before she sits down to learn about it. So she went on up the last turn of the stair, and Mrs. Hibbert came behind with the light, and they came out through a trap in the floor into the domed chamber at the top of the tower, And there Francis Standish stood still altogether and forgot the housekeeper and the candles and the fortune and the whole of the strange day. The dome was a single great room, round, floored with polished oak-worn pale, in a circle by the tread of one man's feet over 30 years. And it was cold and dim and smelt of the sky. And rising up through the middle of it, mounted upon a massive stone pier that went down, she later learned, through all the floors to the very bedrock, so that no tread of foot or gust of wind should shake it, stood the great glass. It was a telescope such as she had read of and never seen, and never in her most extravagant nights thought to stand under. A long tube of mahogany bound in brass, longer than a man is tall, set upon a jointed brass mounting so cunningly counterpoised that when Francis, hardly daring, laid one finger upon it, the whole vast instrument swung as smooth and light as a gate on a good hinge, and followed her hand, and stayed where she left it. Above it the shuttered slot ran up the curve of the dome, and the dome itself, she saw, was made to turn. There was a rope and a wheel and a track of iron let into the wall, so that a single person, even a woman not above the middle height, might haul the whole heavy hemisphere round upon its rollers, and bring the open slot to bear on any quarter of the heavens she chose. A man had thought all this out. A man had drawn it and paid for it and raised it stone by stone on a shelf of a Yorkshire fell, 40 miles from the nearest soul who could have talked to him about it for 10 minutes together, and had climbed these stairs alone 10,000 nights to stand where she stood now, and had died, and had left it, past 40 years of family silence, to a governess he had never seen, because he had come to believe from something that she would understand what it was. And pinned to the wooden housing at the eyepiece end of the great glass, where the observer's hand would fall upon it first of all, was a folded paper with one word written on the outside in the close upright hand she was already beginning to know. A single word. And the word was cousin. Francis took it down with fingers that were not quite steady, and unfolded it, and read it there by the light of Mrs. Hibbert's candles, and it was not long, and it was this. If you are reading this, then Locksley has done his work, and I am in the churchyard, and you have come up my stairs. And if you have come up my stairs before you counted the plate, I think I was not wrong about you. I am sorry, cousin. I am sorry with my whole heart that I did not know you were in the world until it was too late in the day for me to come down off this fell and knock at your door and say, here is another of us. You are not alone in it, as I have been alone in it. I did not know your father lived, nor that he had a daughter, nor that the daughter sat up at her window with a 2-foot glass looking at what I look at, until this last September a thing came to my hand by the merest chance that told me all three at once. What that thing was you will find on the bench below, and I will let it tell you itself, for it will tell you better than I can that you have not come here a stranger. Whatever the deeds and the lawyers say, the tower is yours, the glass is yours, the nights are yours. Use them. That is all I ask of you, and I have no right to ask even that, having done nothing for you but leave you a heap of old stone when I might have given you 30 years of talk. Look after the clock. It wants winding every 9th day. And when you have Saturn fair in the glass some hard clear night this coming winter, think, if you will, of your cousin Cuthbert Ray, who thought of you, at the last, a great deal. Frances read it through twice. Then she folded it very carefully along its old creases and stood holding it in both hands. And Mrs. Hibbert, who had drawn back to the wall out of some old servant's delicacy and had watched the girl's face and not the paper, said quietly into the dimness, "He wrote that in the November, ma'am, the week after the lawyer's word came that you were found. He was too weak to climb by then. He had Skelton carry him up, the once to pin it where he knew whoever loved the glass would put her hand, and then he never came up again. And Frances Standish, who had not wept at the reading of the will, nor at the loss of her situation, nor at the parting from the children she had taught 4 years, stood in the cold turning dome at the top of her tower with her dead cousin's letter in her hands, and wept at last, not loudly and not long, but wholly. For the 30 years of talk that two people who would have understood each other had been cheated of by a quarrel over a marriage and a piece of land before ever either of them was born. When it had passed, she dried her face without apology, for Mrs. Hibbert was a woman who plainly thought the better of her for it and not the worse. And she said, in a voice that was low but had come back level, "Thank you, Mrs. Hibbert. I have seen the tower now. Tomorrow, in the good light, I will begin upon the journals, and you shall show me how the clock is wound and the dome is turned, for I mean to keep this exactly as he kept it, and better if I am able. And now I think we had best go down, for the candles are burning and I have kept you from your evening." They went down together in a companionship that had not been there on the way up, the sort of understanding that grows between two women in 5 minutes over a thing that matters and would not have grown in 5 years over things that did not. And that first night, her first night under the roof of Marrick Hall, Frances Standish did a thing that told the whole house, by the morning, exactly what manner of mistress had come to them. She did not sit late in the great parlor. She had Skelton show her, before he went to bed, how the shutter of the dome was drawn and the great hemisphere hauled round upon its track, and near midnight, when the cloud that had hung all day over the dale broke up at last and streamed away east, and left the whole enormous vault of the spring sky bare and blazing over the fell, as she had never in her life, in any town, seen it blaze. Frances Standish went up her tower alone with a single candle, and put out the candle, and stood in the dark under the open slot, and swung the great glass, light as a gate, down to the south, and put her eye to her dead cousin's eyepiece for the first time. What she saw there she never fully told to anyone, then or after. But Mrs. Hibbert, waking in the small hours and going to her window from an old habit of watching the tower for the master's light, saw the shutter open to the stars for the first time since he died, and a shadow moving slow and glad against the dim sky within, and the old woman stood a while at her own window in her nightgown, and then she went back to her bed and lay down and said to herself, half aloud, "Aye, she's another of them. God be thanked, the old man was right. She's another of them." And so it might have gone on, in that first fair rush of possession and understanding, the new mistress learning her tower and her house and her dale through the sweet lengthening nights of May, had there not come, upon the 4th morning, carried up from Reeth by the carrier and laid by Skelton upon the writing table in the south window with the rest of the morning's post, a letter, and the letter was sealed with a seal Frances did not know, and directed in a clerk's copper-place hand to Miss Frances Standish at Marrick Hall, and when she broke it open and read it, the fair rush ended, and the true business of her inheritance, which was to be no gift at all but a thing fought for, began. The letter was from Mr. Denzil Sturdy, attorney, of Richmond, and it was a masterpiece of its low kind, for it contrived in the space of 1 page to be at once servile and threatening, to congratulate her upon her good fortune, and to inform her that the good fortune was another man's, to name no figure, and yet to make her feel the shadow of a great cost, and to invite her, with every appearance of solicitude, to spare herself the pain and expense of a contest by yielding at once to a claim she had not yet seen a syllable of proof for. Mr. Sturdy, it said, had the honor to act for his client, Mr. Absalom Ray, late of the city of Philadelphia in the United States of America, and now returned to the land of his fathers, who was, Mr. Sturdy averred, the only son of one Jonas Ray, elder brother of the late Cuthbert Ray's father, which Jonas had emigrated in the year 1760, and had been wrongly supposed by the Marrick branch to have died without issue, so that his client stood, by the plain rule of descent, one full degree nearer to the late Cuthbert Ray than did Miss Standish, and was accordingly the heir at law, will or no will, to so much of the estate as was entailed upon the heir of the body, and Mr. Sturdy did most earnestly, and in a spirit of Christian friendship, advise Miss Standish to treat with him before the matter came, as it must otherwise come, into the public and expensive arena of the Court of Chancery. Frances read it twice, once fast and once slow, and then she sat very still at the writing table in the south window, with the letter flat before her, and her hands folded upon its edge. And she did what her father had taught her to do, with a hard thing in the sky that would not at once resolve. She did not stare harder. She looked a little to one side of it, and let the thing declare its own shape, and the shape it declared was this. A man had written to Mr. Locksley within 7 days of the death being known. Before, as Mr. Locksley had said, the grass was on the grave. That was too quick. A stranger newly landed from Philadelphia does not learn of a Yorkshire bachelor's death, and establish his own descent and engage a Richmond attorney and open a correspondence, all within the week, unless he has been sitting close by with the whole thing prepared and waiting only for the old man to die. Whatever Mr. Absalom Ray was, he was not surprised. He had known Cuthbert Ray was dying, and had known what would be worth having when he was dead, and had been ready. That did not of itself make his claim false, but it made it, to Frances's mind, a thing got up beforehand, and things got up beforehand, she thought, will generally show the joiner's marks if a person looks in a good light and does not let herself be hurried. She wrote 3 letters that morning. To Mr. Locksley she wrote plainly that Sturdy's demand had come, that she would yield nothing and treat for nothing, and that she begged him to come up to Marrick at his early convenience and bring with him whatever he judged useful. For she meant to meet the claim and not to buy it off. To Mrs. Ivison, who had asked to be told how she did, she wrote a cheerful ordinary letter about the Dale and the house, and said nothing of the lawyers, for it was not Mrs. Ivison's trouble. And the 3rd letter she wrote to no one, but took down the first of her cousin's journals, the earliest, dated 1776, and began at the beginning to read. For it had come to her, sitting still and looking to one side of the thing, that whatever proof Mr. Absalom Ray meant to bring of his descent from a Ray who left England in 1760, that proof would consist of paper, old letters, an entry in a family Bible, a deposition sworn before some American magistrate, and that paper of that kind lives or dies by its dates, and that there was no man in England, living or dead, who had kept a closer, truer, more exactly dated record of the passing years than the man whose life work stood in 36 volumes on the shelf at her elbow. If Absalom Ray's paper and Cuthbert Ray's journals should ever be laid side by side, and should ever be found to disagree about what the sky had done upon a given night, Frances knew which of the 2 she would believe, and she thought she knew which a magistrate would believe also. She did not yet know that it would come to exactly that. She only felt as an observer feels a faint object at the very edge of vision that is surer seen aslant than straight, that her defense, if she was to have one, lay not in the lawyer's Latin but somewhere in those dated volumes, and so she read them, night upon night, by the great glass, learning her dead cousin's mind and hand and habit, as she learned the disposition of the double stars he had spent his last 10 years cataloging, and she was the readier for it when the reckoning came. Mr. Locksley came up within the week, and with him, unlooked for, came trouble in its own proper person, for Mr. Denzil Sturdy had learned that the solicitor was to be at Marrick, and had contrived to arrive upon the very same afternoon, uninvited, with his client at his heel, so that Frances, going down to the great parlor expecting her own quiet lawyer, found the room holding 4 men and a coming storm. Mr. Locksley rose at once and came to her, grave and glad to see her, and murmured that he was sorry, that these gentlemen had followed him up the dale, and he could hardly have barred the door of her own house against them without a scene upon the gravel. And Frances said, lo, that he had done right, and that she would rather see the enemy's face than guess at it, and she went forward into the room composed and unhurried, and let them be named to her. Mr. Denzil Sturdy was a broad, high-colored man of 45, in a bottle green coat and a waistcoat of an aggressive primrose, with fleshy jowls close-shaved to a shine, a great gold seal ring, and small quick eyes that went round the parlor pricing the furniture even as he bowed over her hand and called her his dear Miss Standish, and said what a very great pleasure, what a melancholy occasion, what a fine old place, how sadly he should regret the necessity, and so on, in a warm running stream of civility that never once reached his eyes. And behind him stood his client. Mr. Absalom Ray was a lean, still sallow man of 35 or so, very plainly and correctly dressed in dark clothes of a good but unfashionable cut, with straight dark hair, a long pale face, and an air of grave respectability so studied and so unbroken that Frances mistrusted it on sight, as she mistrusted a night that was too perfectly clear, knowing that the sky, like a man, is honestest when it shows a little weather. He bowed to her precisely and said, in an accent that had a faint, flat American music in it under a careful English varnish, that he was sensible this was a painful meeting for them both, that he bore her no ill will, that he sought only what was his by the law of God and of England, and that he trusted, whatever the lawyers made of it, they two might part as kin and not as foes. It was very well said. It was, Frances thought, a great deal too well said, by a man who had crossed an ocean to take the roof from over a governess's head. But she inclined her head to him civilly, and asked them all to sit, and rang for Mrs. Hibbert to bring wine, and would not for the world have let one of them see that her heart was going hard under the plum and grey stuff of her bodice. And when they were seated, she said, in a voice she had schooled on the stairs coming down, "Gentlemen, you are welcome to Marrick, and you shall have wine, and you shall say whatever you are come to say, and I will hear all of it. But you will forgive me if I say at the outset that I am not to be talked out of my cousin's house between the wine and the walnuts. Mr. Sturdy has written to me that his client stands nearer in blood than I. If that is proved in a court upon evidence, I shall bow to it, for I was reared to reverence the law, and I have no wish to hold what is not mine. But it must be proved. It is not proved by being asserted warmly in my own parlor. So let us understand one another. I will look at every paper Mr. Ray can bring. I will look at it very carefully indeed. And until a court tells me otherwise, I am mistress here, and I do not treat, and I do not compound, and I do not sell my cousin's tower to spare myself a lawsuit. Now, Mr. Sturdy, you may begin." There was a silence in the parlor of about the length of a held breath. Mr. Locksley, at her side, permitted himself the ghost of a satisfied cough, and Mr. Denzil Sturdy's warm-running civility checked for just a moment, like a stream that meets an unlooked-for stone, before it flowed on again all the smoother. But Frances had seen the check. and had seen the small, quick eyes go once, sharply to her face, and reckon it anew. And she understood that they had come expecting a frightened girl who would be glad to take £500 and go back to her copybooks, and that they had not found her, and that they must now, being the kind of men they were, do something a good deal worse than bully. They must prove their lie. And to prove it, they must show her their paper. And that was all Francis Standish wanted in the world. Mr. Sturdy laid his proofs upon the parlor table with the air of a conjurer who was very sure of his trick. There were 3 things chiefly. There was a leaf torn, he said, from the family Bible of the emigrant Jonas Ray, carried to Philadelphia in 1760, and brought back now by his grandson. And upon it, in a faded brown ink, were set down in the old fashion the births and the deaths of 3 generations of American Rays, beginning with the marriage of Jonas and coming down in a plain descending line to the birth of Absalom himself. There was a bundle of letters, 4 of them, said to have passed between Jonas Ray in Philadelphia and his brother, the Marrick grandfather, in the years just after the emigration, before the quarrel hardened into silence. Letters full of the small news of 2 households an ocean apart, and each folded and directed and sealed in the manner of that day. And there was a deposition, lately sworn before a notary public in the city of Philadelphia, and very handsomely engrossed, in which 2 aged persons of that city testified that they had known the late Jonas Ray and his son and his grandson, and that the said Absalom was in truth and without doubt the last of that line. It was, taken all together, a formidable-looking heap of paper, and Mr. Sturdy spread it and patted it and invited her to observe how full, how circumstantial, how manifestly genuine it all was, and how much kinder to everyone it would be to acknowledge the plain force of it now than to drag it through a 12-month of chancery. Mr. Locksley took the papers up one by one and studied them with his spectacles low on his nose and his face giving nothing, and Frances, sitting across the table with her hands folded, watched not the papers but the 2 men who had brought them, and read a great deal in the watching. She saw that Mr. Sturdy grew, if anything, more voluble as the solicitor studied, filling every silence, pointing out the very things a man points out when he wishes the eye hurried past them. And she saw that Mr. Absalom Ray, by contrast, sat wholly still, and said nothing, and watched Mr. Locksley's hands upon the letters with a fixed, contained attention, like a man watching a surgeon near an artery. And she thought, the loud one is the salesman and the quiet one is the maker, and it is the quiet one's work I must look at, for he made these, and a man's work has his hand in it whether he will or no. When at length she was permitted to take the papers herself, she did not begin with the Bible leaf, though that was the heart of the claim, for she guessed that the Bible leaf would have been made with the most care of all. She began with the letters, the ordinary chatty letters full of household news, because it is in the careless places, the parts a forger thinks do not signify, that the joiner's marks are left. And she read them slowly, one after another, with the particular flat attention she gave to a column of a star catalogue, letting each small statement stand up and be counted, and in the 3rd of the 4 letters, a long cross sheet said to have been written by Jonas Ray in Philadelphia to his brother at Marrick in the spring of the year 1769 she came, near the foot of the 2nd page, upon a sentence that made her hand go quite still upon the paper, though not one muscle of her face moved, for she had learned long ago at her father's side not to cry out at a first sighting until she had made sure. The sentence was this: Jonas Ray, telling his brother of the wonders of the new country and of a hard sickness his wife had lately got through, wrote, "We were all much cast down together in the back end of the year. but are mended now. And I will tell thee of a marvel. For on the night of the great eclipse of the moon this last October, when she was wholly darkened and hung in the sky the color of old blood over the Delaware, my little Absalom that was then but a babe in arms woke and cried out at it as though he knew, and his mother took it for a sign he should live, as thank God he has. Frances read the sentence 3 times. Then she laid the letter down very gently upon the table, and folded her hands again, and said nothing at all, and asked Mr. Sturdy, in a voice of no particular color, whether she might keep the papers by her a few days to study at her leisure, since so grave a matter should not be decided in an afternoon. And Mr. Sturdy, who wished above all things to seem generous and unafraid, said of course, dear Miss Standish, take a week, take a fortnight, only do not, he begged her, let false hope prolong an unhappy business. And so the 4 men presently took their leave. Mr. Sturdy warm and voluble to the last upon the gravel, Mr. Absalom Ray grave and correct, Mr. Locksley grim and thoughtful, and Frances stood at the door and watched their 2 carriages go down the lane under the oaks. And then she turned and went, not to the parlor, and not to her chamber, but straight up the covered passage and up the winding stair to the workroom of the tower, with Jonas Ray's letter in her hand and her heart going hard. For she had, she believed, already caught the joiner at his work, and she meant now to make certain of it beyond the power of any lawyer living to shake her. For here was the thing. The letter said that upon a night in October, in the year 1768, for the writer plainly meant the October before a letter written in the spring of 69, there had been a great eclipse of the moon, a total eclipse. The moon wholly darkened and hung the color of old blood, and Frances Standish, who had kept the reckoning of the heavens since she was a girl, and whose dead cousin had kept it for 50 years in the volumes at her elbow, did not believe there had been any such eclipse. She could not yet swear to it, but she felt the wrongness of it as she would have felt a wrong note in a chime she knew by heart. Eclipses of the moon are not common things nor secret things. They are set down years beforehand in every almanac and nautical ephemeris in Christendom. For the whole round earth that faces the moon sees them at once, and men have foretold them to the hour since before the flood. If there had been a total eclipse of the moon visible over Philadelphia in the October of 1768, then there had been the very same eclipse visible over Marrick, over all England, over half the world. And if there had, then a man who had kept a nightly journal since 1776 would very likely have it noted, and an almanac of the period would have it printed, and the truth of the thing could be got at by any patient person with the books to hand. And Frances Standish had the books to hand. She had, on the shelves of that tower, her cousin's whole run of journals, and his working library of some hundreds of volumes, and she prayed. The very ephemerides and eclipse tables that a serious observer keeps as a joiner keeps his rule, and she meant to spend however many nights it took, going back through the reckoning of the years, until she could stand before a magistrate and say, "Not I feel, not I believe, but I know." And here is the printed proof of it, that upon the night this letter names there was no eclipse of the moon over Philadelphia, nor anywhere else beneath the sky, and that therefore the man who wrote this letter wrote it not in 1769, but lately, out of his own head, and got his marvel wrong, as a forger sitting at a desk in this present year will get a thing wrong that no man who had truly stood under that October sky could ever have got wrong, and that a false letter proves a false Bible leaf and a false deposition and a false claim and a false Absalom Ray. She lit the lamp at the tower bench, and she took down the ephemeris, and she began. It took her 4 nights. On the first she found among her cousin's instruments the very tool she needed, a printed canon of eclipses computed and set out by the Astronomer Royal's office, running back through the whole of the last century, and against it she laid her own working from the ephemeris, doing the reckoning twice by 2 roads, as her father had taught her never to trust a single line of sight, and both roads brought her to the same place, and the place was empty. There had been no total eclipse of the moon in the October of 1768. There had been none at all in that October. The nearest total lunar eclipse of those years had fallen in a different season of a different year altogether, and had in any case been visible chiefly to the far side of the world, on the night the false letter named. The moon over Philadelphia and over Marrick alike had risen full and clear and gone across the whole heaven undimmed, as any child with an almanac might have known, and as no man who had truly watched it could ever have misremembered into blood. On the second night she went back through her cousin's own journals to be doubly sure, and found, with a strange sad tenderness, that Cuthbert Ray as a young man had indeed been observing in those very years, and had noted the ordinary bright full moon of that October without remark, as one notes a thing too plain to dwell on, so that the dead man's own patient hand, 40 years in the grave of its ink, stood witness against the letter that would have robbed his heiress. On the third night, because she was too careful a person to hang so much upon her own soul reckoning, she wrote a letter. She had found, threaded all through her cousin's journals these 10 years past, the name of one correspondent, and one only, a fellow of the Royal Society with whom the recluse of Marrick had exchanged observations of the double stars, a man whose letters her cousin had bound and kept, and whose judgment he had plainly prized above any other living, the Earl of Aysgarth in Wensleydale, the next dale but one to the north. To this gentleman, a stranger to her but no stranger to the Tower, Francis Standish wrote a careful, exact letter, setting out the question of the eclipse of October 1768 purely as a point of the science, without one word of lawyers or of legacies, and asking only whether his own tables confirmed her finding, that no total eclipse of the moon had been visible in that month over the American coast or over England, and she sent it down the dale by the carrier and thought little more of it, for she believed her proof already whole, and asked the corroboration only as a prudent observer asks a second glass. On the fourth night she made fair copies of the whole of her working, the reckoning, the canon, the journal entry, laid out so plainly that a magistrate with no Latin and no science could follow every step from the false marvel to the empty sky, and she ruled the pages and numbered them and folded them, and then she blew out the lamp and stood a while at the open slot of the dome in the dark, looking at the very moon that had hung clear and undarkened over an ocean 50 years before, and had outlasted the man who lied about it, and she felt no triumph, only a great settled quiet, the quiet of a thing brought true. Mr. Locksley, when she laid it all before him 2 days later in the South Library, went through it twice in silence, and at the end took off his spectacles, and looked at her for a long moment with something in his old face that was near to awe, and said, "Miss Standish, I have practiced the law 33 years, and I have seen forgeries broken by handwriting and by watermarks and by the tricks of the seal. But I have never in my life seen a forgery broken by the moon." He built his lie careful. He built it out of little household things, a sick wife, a crying babe, a mother's fancy, the very things that make a letter breathe and that no examiner thinks to doubt. But he reached, for one touch of color, up into the one book that cannot be forged and cannot be bribed and does not care who inherits Marrick, and he got it wrong. And you caught him, because you alone of everyone who was ever likely to read that letter had spent your life with your eye on that book. It is the prettiest thing I ever saw. Now let us hang him with it." What followed was got up with all Mr. Locksley's long craft. He did not go to Chancery, which would have taken a year and a fortune. He wrote to Mr. Denzil Sturdy a short cold letter saying that Miss Standish had examined the papers, that grave question had arisen as to the authenticity of certain of them, and that before the matter went further she desired one meeting, in the presence of a magistrate, at which the questions might be plainly put. And he named the day and the place, the solicitor's own chambers in Richmond, and he named the magistrate, Sir Marmaduke Frankland, a shrewd, hard-headed old baronet of the neighborhood who had sat on the bench 30 years and had no love of chancery tricks, and he let Mr. Sturdy understand, in the cold spaces between the civil words, that he would be very unwise not to come. And Sturdy came, for a guilty man who runs is condemned already, and brought his client, and brought besides a young barrister named Pringle, whom he had retained out of Gray's Inn, a thin, anxious, clever young man who had been given the papers only to argue and had not been let into their making. They were all in the panelled chamber when Francis came in upon Mr. Locksley's arm, and Sir Marmaduke Frankland sat at the head of the green baize table like a block of the local limestone, and Mr. Sturdy began at once upon his warm-running civilities, and Sir Marmaduke cut him off in 4 words. "Sit down, sir, begin," and it was begun. Frances did not raise her voice once in the hour that followed. She let Mr. Locksley lay the ground, and then, when the magistrate turned his hard old eyes upon her and asked her to state plainly what she alleged and upon what ground, she rose and set her numbered pages upon the baize, and told them, step by plain step as she had told the sky, of the marvel in the 3rd letter, of the great darkened moon over the Delaware in the October of 1768, and then she told them, with the cannon of the Astronomer Royal open at the page, and her own doubled working beside it, and her dead cousin's journal beside that upon the night so named there had been no eclipse of the moon at all, that the thing described had not happened, could not have happened, and had never happened, and that a letter which reported as a remembered marvel a celestial event, that the whole science of Europe agreed had never taken place, was a letter written not by a man in Philadelphia in 1769, but by a man at a desk in the present year who had reached for a grand touch and reached into the one book he did not know how to read. There was a silence in the panelled room. Sir Marmaduke Frankland took the cannon and the working into his own thick hands and went through them slowly, for he was a fox-hunting squire and no astronomer. But the thing was laid so plain that no astronomer was needed, and Francis had reckoned on exactly that, and at the end he set them down and looked up, not at Francis, and not at Sturdy, but full and long at the still sallow face of Mr. Absalom Ray, and it was in that moment, before ever a word more was said, that the young barrister Pringle, who was clever and had been watching his client's face and not the papers, went first white and then a deep angry red. For a clever young man does not like to be made the innocent mouth of another man's forgery. And he half rose and said, in a voice that cracked a little, "Sir Marmaduke, I must ask leave to withdraw from this cause. I was given these papers to argue. I was not given to understand." And there he stopped, and looked at Sturdy and said no more, but his withdrawing said all the rest. And Mr. Denzil Sturdy's warm running stream of civility ran quite dry at last, and his high color went blotched and gray, and he began to bluster, that it was a quibble, a woman's fancy, that one might mistake a year, that the good faith of his client was beyond, that he would take it to Chancery yet, and Sir Marmaduke Frankland let him run on about 4 sentences, and then brought one heavy hand down flat upon the green baize so that the inkstand jumped, and said, in the voice he kept for poachers and worse, "You will take nothing to chancery, sir, but your own neck if you are not careful of it. For what I have seen upon this table this morning is not a doubtful claim. It is a forged instrument, and forgery, Mr. Sturdy, is a hanging matter in this country, and I am a magistrate of this county, and I have a very good memory. Now, you will withdraw every claim against this lady, in writing, before you leave this room. You will surrender these papers to Mr. Locksley, all of them, to be kept as they may be wanted. And you and this gentleman from Philadelphia, if that is where he is from, will be out of the North Riding by the week's end, and if I hear either of your names in connection with Marrick again, I will not be answerable for what comes of it. Do we understand one another?" They understood one another. It was done within the half hour, in cold silence, the withdrawal written and signed, the false papers surrendered, and the two men gone out into the Richmond street, the loud one and the quiet one, without one backward word, and Mr. Absalom Ray, going last through the door, turned once and looked at Frances Standish with his long, pale, unreadable face, and she could not tell to the end whether what was in the look was hatred or shame or a strange, grudging craftsman's respect for the one person who had troubled to read his work closely enough to catch him. And then he too was gone, and the door shut, and Marrick was hers past the reach of any lawyer, held not by the will alone, but by her own eye and her own hand, and the incorruptible witness of a moon that had gone across an October sky undimmed before ever she was born. The summer that followed was the first settled summer of Frances Standish's grown life, and she took to it as a plant long kept in too small a pot takes to open ground. With the claim broken and the two men gone south, the whole dale seemed to let out a breath it had been holding on her account, for word of the business had run up and down Swaldale as such words do, and the plain country people, who had watched the new young mistress warily as an unknown quantity, now looked on her with the particular warmth the hard folk keep for one of their own who has stood up to a swindler and won, moreover, by the one thing they most respected, which was not money nor family nor beauty, but plain uncommon cleverness turned to honest use. She went to church her first Sunday as mistress, and was looked at by the whole parish of Marrick from the great box pew that was hers, and she bore the looking with an ease that surprised her, and stayed after to speak to the curate at the porch. Mr. Bramwell was a young clergyman of 28, poor, learned, and shy, with a threadbare good coat and a head full of Greek and of the new chemistry, who served the two churches of the parish for a stipend that would have shamed a groom, and who had been half in dread of the new heiress, expecting some fine, idle woman who would want her hassock moved and her sermons shortened. He found instead a woman who asked him, before they had spoken 5 minutes, whether the parish had ever thought of a subscription school for the children of the miners up the fell, and who, when he owned that it had been his dearest wish these 3 years and quite beyond the parish's means, looked at him with her level gray eyes and said that it was no longer beyond the parish's means, for she had £4,000 in the funds and no children of her own to keep it from, and that they had better sit down together in the week and see what a school would cost. From that hour Mr. Bramwell was hers body and soul, not as a suitor, for he was too poor and too honest ever to have lifted his eyes so high, and she never for a moment thought of him so, but as an ally in good works. And the two of them, the shy scholar and the astronomer, got up between them that summer a school for the fell children that outlasted them both. And into her daily life, by a natural and happy accident, came the companion she had not known she wanted. Mrs. Hibbert, the housekeeper, had a daughter, Tabitha, a bright, quick-handed girl of 19 who had been apprenticed to a milliner in Richmond and hated it, and who came home to Marrick that June with her indentures bought out, and Frances, finding the girl reading a borrowed novel in the walled garden one afternoon and blushing to be caught at it, sat down beside her on the warm stone and talked to her instead of past her, and discovered a quick, untaught mind and a great hunger, and within the month Tabitha Hibbert had left off being the housekeeper's daughter and become, by no formal arrangement that anyone ever wrote down, Miss Standish's companion, reading aloud to her in the South Library of an evening, keeping her a little company on the milder nights at the foot of the tower stair when Frances went up to observe, learning her letters and her figures and, by degrees, the names of the very stars, so that Marrick Hall, which had held one silent man and his silence for 30 years, came alive that summer, with the sound of 2 women's voices and the turning of pages and, once or twice a week, the low far-off rumble of the great dome being hauled round upon its track under the June and July skies. Frances did not let the good works and the good company keep her from the tower. If anything, she went up the oftener now, for the nights were her cousin's true bequest to her, and she had a use for them beyond her own delight. She had resolved, that first summer, that she would not merely keep Cuthbert Ray's tower as a monument, but would carry on his work. For she had found, reading the journals through, that his great labor of the last 10 years, a catalogue of the double stars, those pairs of suns that lie so close in the glass that a lesser instrument shows them as one, had been left unfinished at his death, some 400 pairs measured and set down, and perhaps 100 more begun, and it seemed to her a finer memorial than any stone to take up the measuring where his hand had faltered and carry the catalogue to its end, and see it printed one day under both their names, the man who began it and the cousin who finished it, so that the torn family should be mended at the last not by lawyers, but by a column of figures reaching from his grave to her hand. And so through that summer and the autumn after it she measured the doubles, night upon clear night, with Tabitha, to write down the figures she called out of the dark. And she was happier in it than she had ever thought to be. And she would have said, had anyone asked her, that her inheritance was already whole and needed nothing added to it. But it was not quite whole yet. There was still the thing Mr. Locksley had spoken of, and her cousin's letter had spoken of, and neither had named, the thing that had come to Cuthbert Ray's hand in the September before he died, and told him he was not the last of his blood. And she came upon it at last, as she came upon most true things, sideways, and when she was looking for something else. It was a wild, wet night in the back end of October, no night for the glass, and Frances had gone up to the tower workroom not to observe, but to set the journals in better order, for they had been shelved anyhow, and she wished them dated and squared. And in the doing of it she took down the last volume of all, the one her cousin had been keeping in the very autumn of his death, and a thing fell out of it from between the last written leaf and the board, and fluttered to the floor at her feet. She picked it up. It was a page torn, not from a book, but from a printed periodical, a single leaf gone soft and much handled as though it had been carried a long time in a pocket and taken out and read 100 times, and across the top of it ran the title of a philosophical magazine that Frances knew, for her own father had taken it in his poor way, and she had read it as a girl, a monthly miscellany of the sciences printed in London that gave, among its notices and its letters, a column or two in each number to the reports of country observers, the amateurs, the parsons and the half-pay officers, and the odd star-gazing spinster, who sent up their small findings from their gardens and their attics to the great world. And upon this leaf, ringed round and round in her cousin's brown ink until the ring had near worn through the paper, was one such notice, and the notice was hers. She stood in the cold workroom with the wet October wind buffeting the arrow slits, and she read her own words come back to her out of the past. 3 years before, in the second year of her governess life at Richmond, sitting up at the attic window under the slates on the hard clear nights when the wool town slept, Frances Standish had watched a certain faint star in the constellation of the Swan that did not behave as a star should, that swelled slowly to a modest brightness over some weeks and as slowly failed again, and swelled again, keeping its own long faithful rhythm as the moon keeps hers, and she had watched it a whole year through her father's 2-foot glass and had set down its changes night by night, and had reckoned its period as near as she could, and then, greatly daring, telling no one, not the Ivesons, not a soul, she had written the whole of it out in a fair plain letter, and sent it up to London to the editor of the Philosophical Magazine, signing it not with her name, for she had thought a woman's name upon such a thing would be laughed at or passed over, but with her initials only, and the town F.S. of Richmond in Yorkshire. And they had printed it. They had printed it in a corner of a summer number, 20 lines of a governess's careful watching of a variable star, and she had bought the number with a shilling she could ill spare, and had read her own anonymous words in print with a secret joy she had never confessed to anyone, and had then put it away and gone on hearing children construe their Latin, and had thought that was the end of it, a small candle lit once in the dark and let go out. It had not been the end of it, for the same magazine went, by its slow country roads, up every dale in England to every lonely man who cared for such things, and one copy of that summer number had come, 3 years before, to a squat stone tower on a shelf of the fell in Swoledale, to an old recluse measuring his double stars in his solitude and believing himself the last of a torn family, and the last very nearly of his kind. And Cuthbert Ray had read the 20 lines signed F.S. of Richmond, and had known at once, with the quickened certainty of an old craftsman who sees his own hand in a stranger's work, that here was no idle amateur, but a true observer, patient, exact, unafraid of a whole year's labor for one faint truth, and something in the initials, or in the town so near his own, or in the mere unlikelihood of it, had set the old man wondering, and he had made inquiry quietly, through the editor and through a bookseller, and at the last through Mr. Locksley, and had learned, that September before he died, 3 things together that turned his solitude over like a spade turning wintered ground: that the writer was a woman, that her name was Frances Standish, and that she was the daughter of one Edmund Standish, sometime curate of Ripon, who had been the son of the very brother his own father had quarrelled with and cast off before either observer was born. The last of the Rays was not the last after all. There was another of the blood, and she was young, and she was living 40 miles off in a garret over a wool merchant's counting house, and she was doing, unhelped and unknown and self-taught, the very thing to which he had given his whole long solitary life. And beneath the ringed and worn-through notice, tucked into the same last volume, Frances found the other thing, and it was the thing that finished her, a letter in her cousin's close, upright hand, begun and never sent, breaking off after half a page where the pen had plainly grown too heavy for the failing hand to drive. "My dear cousin Frances," it began, "for I find I cannot write Miss Standish to my own blood and my own kind, though we have never met, and it is my own family's ancient folly that we have not. I have this day learned who you are, and I am an old man and not well, and I have wasted, through no fault of yours, and little enough of mine, the years in which I might have been to you what I would now give the whole of Marrick to have been, an uncle, a teacher, a friend in the one strange science that has been my life and is, I think, becoming yours. I read your account of the variable in the swan 100 times before ever I knew whose it was, and I will tell you plainly, as one observer to another, and not as an old man flattering a girl, that it was better work than half of what the fellows send up to the society under their grand names. For you had done the one thing that cannot be taught. You had watched faithfully a whole year, for no reward, because the truth was worth the watching. I have a tower here, and a glass such as you have surely never had the use of, and it is failing to a man who can no longer climb to it, and I mean, if God gives me the little time, to see that it comes to you, who will climb to it, and who will see with it the things these old eyes are letting go. There is so much I would say to you. There is so much I would show you. The double in cannot get further. She read the broken letter through in the turning dome with the wind at the shutters, and then she sat down upon her cousin's own stool at the bench and put her face in her hands and wept for the second time in that tower, and this time longer, for the first weeping had been for a stranger, and this was for a friend, an uncle, a teacher, a whole warm human bond that had reached across 40 years of family silence and 40 miles of fell, and had touched her, once in the very hour it was too late, and had left her this half-page and a tower, and the whole of the rest of her life, to say back to him the things he had run out of strength to say to her. And when it had passed, she did the only thing there was to do, which was the thing he had asked. She dried her face, and she took the ephemeris and the great glasses log, and she turned to the last entry in the last journal. The last figures the old man had set down before his hand failed, a half-measured double star in the constellation of the lion that he had begun and not finished, and Francis Standish took up the work at the exact place his pen had left it, and finished the measure he had begun, and wrote the result into his journal under his own last line, in her own hand, so that the two hands ran on together down the page without a break. The old and the young, the man who had watched alone, and the cousin who would not now let him be alone even in his grave. And beneath it she wrote, not as a scientist but as the niece she should have been, the first words of the long answer she meant to spend her life making. I have come, cousin. I have climbed your stairs. I have your glass, and I have your nights, and I will finish your doubles, every one, and see them printed under both our names. And the family that tore itself in two before we were born is mended now, here, in this book, in these figures, for as long as men look up. Thank you. And she wound the clock, for it was the 9th day. That winter, the first true winter of her possession, was the making of Francis Standish, if the breaking of the false claim had been the proving of her. For the aftermath of a great strain is a dangerous quiet, and many a person who has stood firm through the storm goes to pieces in the calm that follows, having spent upon the fight the whole store of strength that was meant to last a life. And Francis, alone in a great gray house on a fell in the shortest and blackest days of the year, with the enemy gone and the lawyers paid and nothing left to fight, might well have sunk into the low country of the spirits that waits for solitary people in December. She did not sink. She had found her cousin's broken letter and her own printed notice in the October, and the finding had given her, in place of the fight, a work, and she set herself to the work through the whole of that winter with a will that surprised even Mrs. Hibbert, who thought she had by then taken the measure of her mistress. Frances resolved that she would write her cousin's life, not a great published memoir, for he had shunned the world and would not have thanked her for dragging his name into it, but a true, plain account for herself and for whoever should come after her in the tower, of who Cuthbert Ray had been and what he had done and why it mattered, set down out of the journals and the letters and the testimony of the old servants who had loved him. And she spent the long dark evenings of that December and January in the South Library with the journals about her and Tabitha reading or sewing across the hearth, piecing the old man's solitary years together entry by entry, learning him as she had learned the disposition of his double stars, until she felt she knew him better dead than most people know their kin alive. And in the learning of him she healed her own strange grief for the friend she had been cheated of. For it is a truth that the surest cure for the ache of a loss is to take up, with both hands, the work the lost one laid down, and by the turn of the year Frances Standish grieved for her cousin still, and would to the end of her days, but she grieved as one grieves for a companion gone on ahead, not as one grieves for a door shut in the face. Mr. Locksley came up more than once through that winter, on the pretext of estate business, but in truth, she came to understand, out of a plain fatherly wish to see that the young woman he had championed did not want for company in her first hard season alone, and the old solicitor and the young astronomer became, over those winter fires, fast friends, so that the reading of a will that had begun their acquaintance in a schoolroom grew into one of the settled affections of both their lives. He told her, one snowbound evening when the drifts had shut the lane and he must stay the night whether he would or no, more of the story of the old quarrel than he had been able to tell her at the first. How her great-grandfather and Cuthbert's grandfather, the two brothers, had fallen out over a marriage the elder thought beneath the family, and a strip of river meadow the younger thought his by right, and how a hot word had hardened into a cold silence, and the silence into two households that struck each other out of the family Bible, and how her own grandfather cast off had gone into the church poor, and her father after him poorer still, while the Marrick branch kept the land and the money and the tower, and, in the end, the loneliness that money and land and towers cannot fill. It is an old story, Miss Standish, the old man said, gazing into the fire as old as Cain, 2 brothers and a piece of ground, and the children pay for it 3 generations down who never knew what the quarrel was about. And it is only mended, when it is mended at all, by some one soul on one side or the other, who is great enough or humble enough to reach across it first. Your cousin reached across it, at the very last, when he learned you were in the world. It cost him nothing, you will say, for he was dying and had no one else to leave it to. But I knew him a little, at the end, and I do not think it was only that. I think a lonely man who had believed himself the last of a bad business found, in his last autumn, that he was not the last, that the torn thing might be knit whole after all in the person of a clever girl who did the very work he did, and I think it gave him, at the death, a peace he had not looked to have. You gave him that, Miss Standish, by the mere fact of being alive and being what you are, before ever you knew he breathed. Remember it, when the house is dark and you think the whole affair a cold one. It was not cold at the last. And Frances remembered it, and it warmed many a dark evening after, and when the light came back to the dale in February and March, and the first curlews returned crying to the high fields, and the school reopened, and the nights drew in, and the doubles could be measured again. She came up out of that first winter not broken by the calm, but tempered by it, sure of her house and her work and her place in the dale as she had never in her wandering life been sure of anything, and ready, though she did not know it, for the one thing her tempered new life still lacked and was about to be given. The reply from the Earl of Aysgarth had come, in fact, some weeks before that wild October night, in the very thick of the business of the claim, and Frances had read it then only for the one thing she needed, the confirmation of her eclipse. But she took it out and read it again, whole, in the days after she found the broken letter, and read it now with different eyes. It was a long letter, and a warm one, and not at all the letter of a great nobleman condescending to a country spinster. The Earl wrote that he had received her inquiry with an interest he could scarcely express, that her finding was entirely correct, that his own tables and every table in Europe agreed that no total eclipse of the moon had been visible over England or over America in the October of the year she named, and that he would stake his reputation as a fellow upon it, and then, having answered the point of science she had asked, he went on, unasked, to the thing that plainly moved him more, which was that her letter had been directed from Marrick Hall. He had known Cuthbert Ray, he wrote, these 20 years, known him by letter, that is, for the old man would never come down off his fell, nor suffer a visitor up it, and he had prized their correspondence above almost any in his life, and had grieved at the news of his death as at the loss of a brother, the more sharply for never once having shaken the hand of the one man in the north, who had truly understood his own long labor among the double stars. And now, he wrote, a letter came to him out of that same silent tower, in a woman's hand, asking a question of exactly the kind Cuthbert Ray would have asked, exact, unshowy, going straight to the reckoning, and he confessed that his heart had risen at it, that he had sat with her letter a long while, and that he must beg her pardon for the liberty, but he could not forbear to ask, was the tower then in hands that valued it? Was the great glass that he had heard of for 20 years and never seen to be kept and used, or was it to be shrouded and sold with the rest of a dead recluse's lumber? For if it was to be used, and used by a person who could catch out a forger with an eclipse cannon, then he, the Earl of Aysgarth, would count it among the good fortunes of his later life to be permitted, some day, at her entire convenience and pleasure, to climb at last the stairs his old friend had never let him climb, and to look through the glass, and to make, however late, the acquaintance of the one household in the north that shared his ruling passion. It was, Frances thought, reading it now by the fire in the South Library, with Tabitha sewing across the hearth, a letter that asked leave very handsomely to be allowed to become a friend, and she found, considering it, that she was disposed to grant the leave. She wrote back to him before the month was out, and told him, since he had loved her cousin, the whole of the business of the claim, and how his own confirmation of the eclipse had helped to break it, and she told him that the tower was most certainly in hands that valued it, that she was carrying on the double-star catalogue where her cousin's hand had failed, and that the stairs his old friend had never let him climb were open to the Earl of Aysgarth whenever he should care to come up the dale, though she warned him fairly that he would find at the top of them no learned society, but only a governess with a good eye and a great deal still to learn. And having sent it, she thought little more of it through the busy back end of that year, for the school was opening. The subscription school for the Fell children opened its doors that November, in a stone building by the beck that Frances had bought and Mr. Bramwell had fitted up, and it wanted a teacher, and here Frances did a thing that gave her a private happiness out of all proportion to its size. She wrote to Richmond, and then to Ripon, and traced at last an old friend of her own hard years, a Miss Forsett, a clergyman's daughter like herself who had been companion teacher beside her in her first place, and had since been left, by the death of the aunt she kept house for, as friendless and unprovided as Frances herself had been that spring, and Frances offered her the mistress-ship of the Fell school, a decent stipend, and a snug 2 rooms in the schoolhouse. and Miss Forsett came up the dale before Christmas with her one trunk, as Frances had come with hers, and wept upon the gravel of Marrick to be so remembered. And Frances, who had not forgotten 1 hour of what it was to be a woman alone with a good mind and no place in the world, thought that of all the things her cousin's £4,000 had bought, this was perhaps the one he would have liked the best. So the year turned. The doubles were measured on the clear nights, and the school went forward on the dark ones. Tabitha grew from a milliner's runaway into a young woman who could reduce an observation and knew the Greek letters of the constellations. Miss Forsett drilled the Fell children in their letters and blessed the name of Standish. Mr. Bramwell preached his shy-learned sermons to a fuller church. Mrs. Hibbert kept the keys, and Mr. Pendle kept the farm, and old Skelton kept the door. And Marrick Hall, that had been one man's monument to his own solitude, became in the space of a single year a house full of women's voices and children's futures, and the slow turning of the great dome under the winter stars. And Frances Standish, who had come up the dale in April, a governess with one trunk and no kin and no expectation of anything but a life of other people's children, stood at the open slot of her tower on the last hard clear night of that year, the old year going out and the new coming in over the black shoulder of the Fell, and swung the great glass down to the Swan, and found, low and faint and faithful in the eyepiece, the very variable star whose 20 lines of careful watching had, unknown to her, reached across England 3 years before and told a dying old man that he was not alone, and had brought her, by roads no one could have foreseen, to this tower and this dale and this life, and she watched it a long while in the cold, her breath smoking in the starlight, and she was not lonely, and she thought that whatever the coming year should bring, and she did not then know it would bring the greatest change of all, she had already, in the tower and the doubles and the school and the friends, more than she had ever in her narrow days thought to ask of the world. She did not yet know that the Earl of Aysgarth was coming up the dale in the spring. He came in the last week of April, a year almost to the day since Frances had first come up the dale herself, and he came without state, in a plain traveling chaise with one servant, having written beforehand to ask, with a diffidence that sat oddly upon a man of his rank, whether the following Thursday would suit, and whether he might be permitted to stay the one night at the inn at Reeth, so as to have a whole evening of the glass if the sky were clear, and whether she was quite sure, that he would not be putting the household about. Frances read the anxious, careful letter and smiled, and wrote back that Thursday would suit very well, that the sky, by her cousin's barometer and her own reckoning, promised fair, and that he would not put the household about in the least, and that he might have not one evening of the glass but 2, for the moon was young and would be down early, and the nights were dark and good, and she found, sending it, that she was looking forward to the Thursday with a lightness she had not felt about the coming of any stranger in her life. Hugh Danby, the 5th Earl of Aysgarth, was a tall, spare, grey-eyed man of 48, with iron-grey hair worn unpowdered, and a long, weathered scholar's face lined by much looking into the cold, and plain dark blue clothes of good cloth, and no ornament whatever but the plain gold ring of a Fellow of the Royal Society. And when he got down from the chaise upon the gravel of Marrick and Frances came out to meet him, the first thing she noticed was that he did not look at the house, as Sturdy had looked at it, pricing the furniture, but looked past it at once and upward, to the pale dome of the tower against the April sky, with a naked, hungry reverence he made no attempt to hide. The look of a man who has waited 20 years to see a thing and sees it at last. And the first thing he said to her, after the barest civilities, hat still in his hand, was, "Miss Standish, forgive me, but is that the Shudder I have heard of these 20 years? The one he had made to turn the whole dome? I could scarce believe it when he described it, and Frances, who had braced herself to be gracious to a great man, and found instead a fellow enthusiast on her own gravel, laughed outright, the first easy laugh she had given a stranger in years, and said, "It is, my lord, and it turns yet. And I will show it you before you have so much as had your tea, if that is what you are come for I can see very plainly that the house and the tea are nothing to you, and the dome is all." And the Earl of Aysgarth looked at her then for the first time properly, met her level grey eyes with his own, and something passed between them, some recognition, not of the heart yet that would come, but of the deep glad relief of one solitary of a rare tribe finding another. And he said, gravely, but with the beginning of a smile in the weathered face, "You understand me exactly, Miss Standish. The house and the tea are nothing. Show me the dome." So she showed him the dome, and it was not tea time but near midnight before either of them thought of the house again. They went up the winding stair together, she going before with the light as Mrs. Hibbert had once gone before her, and she brought him into the domed chamber and named him the Great Glass, and stood back, and the Earl of Aysgarth walked up to Cuthbert Ray's telescope and laid one long hand upon the mahogany tube, as a man lays his hand upon the shoulder of a friend, and stood a moment without speaking, and Frances, watching, saw the grief and the wonder work together in his face, and had the grace to say nothing, and let him have his moment with the dead man's instrument. And then the evening became one long shared delight, such as neither of them had ever had in the whole of their observing lives. For each had watched always alone, she in her garrets, and he, for all his rank, in his own great cold observatory at Aysgarth, with only paid assistants who did not love it. And now here were two who loved it, at one glass, under one dark spring sky, and the hours went by unregarded. He showed her a thing about the mounting she had not understood. She showed him her own working of the doubles, and he went through it and grew quiet and said, at length, that it was very good, that it was better than good, that Cuthbert had told him true. And when at last, near 1 in the morning, they had Saturn fair in the glass, the ringed shape hanging small and perfect and impossible in the dark, the Earl of Aysgarth stood back from the eyepiece and let her look, and watched not the planet but her face as she looked, and said very low, half to himself, he was right. Of course he was right. He was always right about the sky. I only wish to God he had lived to stand here with the pair of us. And Frances, her eye still at the glass and the rings of Saturn swimming in it, and something swimming in her too that she did not yet have a name for, said softly, "So do I, my lord. But I think perhaps that he does. I think he is not so far off, on a night like this, as the daylight world would have us believe." And the Earl of Aysgarth was silent a while, and then he said, "No, I do not think he is far off either." And neither of them said anything more for a long time, but stood together in the turning dark under the open slot with the whole spring heaven wheeling slow above them. And it was, though neither would have presumed to say so, the beginning of the thing. He did not stay one night at the inn at Reeth. He stayed 3, and came again a fortnight after, and again before the month was out. And by the height of that summer the sight of the Earl of Aysgarth's plain chaise coming up the lane under the oaks had grown so much a part of the rhythm of Marrick that Mrs. Hibbert kept a room always aired for him, and Mr. Pendle asked his opinion on the drainage of the low close, and old Skelton, who missed nothing in 40 years, had begun to lay his lordship's place at the dinner table without being told. It was the most gradual courtship, if courtship it could yet be called, that ever crept up upon two people who were the last to see it. For they did not, at the first, court at all. They worked. The great labor of that summer was the double-star catalogue, Cuthbert Ray's unfinished life's work, and the Earl of Aysgarth threw himself into the finishing of it beside her with a will, coming up to measure on the clear nights, going through her reductions on the wet ones, until the 400 pairs the old man had left grew to 500 and to 6, every one confirmed twice over by 2 glasses and 2 hands, and it was the Earl who said, one August evening in the South Library, with the sheets spread between them, that the thing was too good to lie in a drawer, that it must go to the Royal Society and be printed. And printed, he insisted, under both the names it had cost, the catalogue of Cuthbert Ray of Marrick, completed by Frances Standish, his kinswoman, and when Frances demurred and said that no learned society in London would print a woman's name upon a work of the science, and that she would as soon it went under her cousin's name alone, the Earl of Aysgarth set down his pen and looked at her across the sheets with a sudden quiet heat in his grey eyes, and said, "They will print it under both names, Miss Standish, or they will not have it at all. For I am a fellow of 22 years standing, and I will carry it in with my own hands and lay it on the table myself, and I should like to see the man who will strike your name off it in my hearing. You watched a whole year for one faint star with no reward and no name and no help, because the truth was worth the watching. That is not a woman's work nor a man's work. It is the only kind of work there is. And it will have your name upon it." And Frances Standish, who had defended her inheritance dry-eyed against a forger and a magistrate, found that she had no defense at all against being valued, exactly, for the one thing she had always most been and least been thanked for, and she looked down at the sheets and said, "Lo, that he was very good," and could not for a moment say more. His mother came in September. The Dowager Countess of Aysgarth was a small, upright old lady of near 80 with her son's grey eyes and a tongue that had frightened half the peerage for 60 years. And she came up the dale, she announced on the gravel, for the express purpose of seeing what manner of person had so entirely deranged the habits of a son who had not, to her certain knowledge, stayed 3 nights from his own observatory in 20 years for any cause under heaven, and she stayed a week, and watched everything with her sharp old eyes, the tower and the school and the household, and above all, the 2 of them together, and at the end of the week she took Frances's 2 hands in her own small dry ones, and said, "I came here, child, expecting to find some scheming country miss who had got her hooks into a lonely widower for his coronet, and I find instead that my son has at last, at 48, met the only creature in England as odd as himself, and that you care no more for his coronet than he does, which is not at all, and that the pair of you would rather look at a double star than be presented at court, which is a taste I have never shared, and have long since given over hoping to cure in him. He will ask you before the year is out. He is very slow and very much afraid, for he has been alone a long time and values you too much to be hasty. When he asks you, do not, I beg, keep him waiting out of any missish notion of what is due. Life is short, and the pair of you have wasted enough of it apart already. God knows, the whole family has, this 40 years. Say yes, and be done, and let an old woman see her son happy before she goes." And Frances, much moved, said only that she did not think his lordship had any such intention, and the Dowager Countess laughed the short dry laugh her son had got from her, and said, "Child, you can find a forger out with the moon, and you cannot see that a man is in love with you when he crosses 2 dales in the rain to carry your figures. You are like him. You see everything in the sky and nothing on the ground. Look down, now and then. It is worth the looking. She went away south the next day and left Frances thoughtful. For the truth of it, which the sharp old woman had seen in a week and the two principals had not seen in half a year, was that it had happened, quietly, under the cover of the work, as the best of it does. Frances Standish had fallen in love, not with a coronet, nor with a rescuer. For the Earl of Aysgarth had never once tried to rescue her from anything, and she would have thought the less of him if he had. But with a mind like her own, and a solitude like her own, and a reverence like her own, with the one man in the north who looked past a house at a dome, who would carry her name into the Royal Society against all the fellows of England, who stood beside her at the glass in the dark and grieved with her for the dead cousin they had shared and never both known. And she began at last to let herself believe, had fallen in the same way with her. But he did not speak, all through that golden autumn, and Frances, remembering his mother's counsel, did not, in her own quiet pride, do anything to hurry him, and so the thing hung, sweet and unspoken, between two people too used to solitude to be quick at happiness, until a hard, bright night in the very end of the year brought it, as it had brought everything else in her strange new life, out of the sky. It was 2 nights before the year's end, and hard and still and bright with frost, the sort of night that comes but a few times in a winter, and that no true observer will waste in his bed. And the Earl of Aysgarth had come up the dale for it, as they had both known he would, and they were at the glass together near midnight, working through a difficult close double in the constellation of the twins that had defeated them twice already. When the thing at last was said, he had been at the eyepiece a long while trying to split the pair, and had drawn back at last and shaken his head, and said the air was not steady enough, that the stars were boiling, and had given her the place, and Frances had bent to the glass and waited, patient, as her father had taught her, for the one still instant that the worst air gives now and then between its tremblings. And in that instant the double had split clean before her eye, 2 separate points of light where all evening there had been one. And she had said quietly in the dark, "There, now, I have them too." And the Earl of Aysgarth, standing close behind her in the cold, said, in a voice quite changed from the one he used about the science, low and not quite steady, "So have I, Frances. I have had them too, this long while, and been afraid to say so, lest I should lose the both by grasping. But I am 8 and 40, and my mother tells me I am a fool, and she is generally right, and the year is going out, and I find I cannot let another one go over this fell without having asked you. I am not a man who says things prettily. I have lived too much alone and too much in the cold for that. But I have never in my life wanted anything as I want to spend the rest of my nights at this glass, and my days in that house, with you, not to rescue you, for you have never needed rescuing, and I should not presume, not to raise you, for you raised yourself long before I came, but only to be, if you will have me, no longer the last solitary of our odd tribe, as your cousin was to the end, and as I have been, but one of a pair, close set, like the stars we measure, that a lesser glass would take for one. Will you marry me, Frances Standish? Will you let an old stargazer come in out of the cold? Frances Standish did not lift her eye from the glass at once. She kept it there a moment longer on the 2 split points of the double in the twins, close set and separate and shining, and she found that her sight of them had gone strangely blurred, and knew why, and did not mind, and then she stood up slowly in the dark and turned to him, and she remembered his mother's counsel. Look down, now and then, it is worth the looking. And she looked, not at the sky, but full at the long, weathered, anxious face of the man before her, waiting in the starlight for her word as she had once waited for the still instant in the boiling air, and she said, in a voice that was low and level and wholly sure, I will, my lord. I will marry you. I have been the last solitary of the tribe myself, remember, longer than you, for you at least had your correspondents and your fellows, and I had a garret and a 2-foot glass and no one in the world to tell when I split a double. I have had a year of not being alone in this tower, and I have found I like it very much better than the 26 years that went before. I do not care that you are an earl. I should marry you just the same if you kept a toll gate, provided you kept it clear-eyed and knew the constellations. But I will tell you what I do care for. I care that you would carry my name into the society against all of them. I care that you grieved for my cousin. I care that you looked past my house at my dome. Yes, I will have you. Come in out of the cold. And the Earl of Aysgarth took both her cold hands in both of his in the dark of the turning dome, under the open slot, with the whole frost-bright heaven blazing down upon the two of them. And he did not kiss her then, for they were neither of them hasty people, and there would be time, all the time in the world now. But he bowed his gray head over her hands and held them hard against the cold, and said only thank you, in the same low voice her cousin had used in the letter. Thank you, the word of a solitary who has been given, late and past all expectation, the one thing he had stopped letting himself hope for. And above them, unregarded now, the 2 stars of the double in the twins that Francis had split at the very instant the question was asked, hung close and separate and shining in the eyepiece, until the slow turning of the whole sky carried them at last out of the field of the glass. Together, the news went down the dale faster than any carrier could have carried it, and came back up again swollen with the dale's plain, rough gladness. For the fell folk had taken Frances Standish for their own the day she broke the swindler with the moon, and now their own was to be a countess. And yet, they told one another with satisfaction, not the kind of countess that would go off south and forget them. For was she not keeping Marrick and the tower and the school and the whole of it? And was not the Earl himself no more than a plain stargazing gentleman for all his coronet? And had he not asked Pendle's opinion on the drainage of the low close with his own mouth? The Dowager Countess of Aysgarth, when her son wrote to her, sent back a single line that Frances kept all her life, folded with her cousin's letters. You have done the one sensible thing of your life, and it took you 48 years, and I forgive you the delay. Bring her to me at Christmas. Mr. Bramwell read the banns for the first time upon the 2nd Sunday in January, in the wide old church at Marrick. In his shy, learned voice grown that morning a little unsteady, with feeling, for he owed his school and half his happiness to the woman whose name he now published. I published the banns of marriage between Hugh Danby of Aysgarth in the county of York, widower, and Frances Standish of Marrick Hall in this parish, spinster. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. And no man declared it, for there was no cause and no impediment under heaven, only 40 years of family folly at last undone. And he read them again the 3rd Sunday and the 4th. And the 3rd time old Skelton the butler, standing in the servants' pew with Mrs. Hibbert and Tabitha and Mr. Pendle, was seen by the whole church to take out a great linen handkerchief and blow his nose with the report of a fowling piece, which in a man of 40 years' iron dignity was as good as a flood of tears, and was understood by all to be so. They were married upon a bright, cold morning in the last week of February, a year and some months from the wet March afternoon when a governess had first heard read aloud in a schoolroom the will of a cousin she had never met. It was not a grand wedding, for neither of them wished it, but it was a full one, for the whole parish came. Frances wore no white satin nor orange flowers, but a good gown of dove-gray silk, the first fine gown of her life, with her mother's thin ribbon at the throat and no jewel but the plain gold ring the Earl had given her that was the mate of his own fellow's ring. And she walked up the frosty lane from the hall to the church upon the arm of old Mr. Locksley, who had asked, with a diffidence that touched her, whether an old lawyer of no kin at all might be let stand in a father's place for a bride who had none, and whom she had answered by taking his arm on the spot, and saying that he had done more for her in 1 year than most fathers do in 20, and should certainly give her away. The fell children of the subscription school lined the lane on both sides in their clean pinafores, drilled by Miss Forsett, and Frances went up between them, and Tabitha Hibbert walked behind as her one attendant, in a new gown that was the pride of her heart, and Mr. Bramwell married them at the old stone altar under the plain north light, and his voice held steady this time to the end. The Earl of Aysgarth put the ring upon her finger and said the words after the curate in his low-weathered voice, "To have and to hold from this day forward," and Frances said them back to him, for better for worse, and looked up at him as she said it with her level gray eyes quite steady and quite full. And the thing that had begun in a turning dome over a split double star was made, before God and the whole parish of Marrick, a marriage. And when it was done, and the register signed, Hugh Danby and Frances his wife, in the two hands that had run on together down the page of a dead man's journal, they came out of the porch into the bright, cold morning, and the fell children cheered. And the bells of Marrick that had not rung a wedding peal in 30 years rang out over the dale and rolled away up the fell and were flung back by the far grey slopes, and Frances Standish, that had come up the dale a year before a governess with one trunk and no kin and no expectation of anything, went down the frosty lane a countess upon her husband's arm, past the cheering children and the ringing tower, home to the house and the walled garden and the great glass that were hers, and now theirs, and would be, she thought, looking up once at the pale dome against the hard blue winter sky, a place where the tribe of the two of them, the odd solitary tribe that looked past houses at domes, need never, from this day, be solitary again. They did not go away upon a wedding journey to the lakes or to the south, as their rank would have permitted and their neighbors half expected. They went up the tower. The very night of the wedding was hard and clear, as if the sky itself had kept fair for them, and when the last of the wedding guests were gone and the house was quiet, the Earl and Countess of Aysgarth climbed the winding stair together in the frost, husband and wife now, and drew the shutter, and hauled the great dome round upon its track, the two of them at the wheel where the old man had turned it alone, and observed until the dawn came grey over the fell. And Mrs. Hibbert, waking in the small hours from her old habit, and going to her window, and seeing the tower open to the stars on such a night, understood, and smiled in the dark, and went back to her bed content. They kept Marrick as their home, for all the Earl's greater house at Aysgarth stood but 2 dales off, he said, and meant it, that his own observatory was a cold grand barn of a place beside Cuthbert Ray's tower, and that a man does not leave the best glass in the north to go and sit in a worse one for the sake of a larger dining room. And so Marrick Hall, that had been a bachelor recluse's monument to his solitude, became a marriage's living heart. The school going forward down by the beck under Miss Forsett's rule, and paid for now out of an earl's purse and no longer straitened, Tabitha Hibbert grown into a young woman of parts who reduced the observations in a fair round hand, and was courted, before long, by a decent young surveyor from Richmond, and made a match of her own, Mr. Bramwell given at last, by the Earl's gift, a living worth the holding, so that the shy scholar need no longer serve 2 churches for a groom's wage, old Skelton keeping the door, and Mrs. Hibbert the keys, and Mr. Pendle the farm, into a comfortable age. And in the spring of the year after the wedding, a parcel came up the dale from London, and Frances opened it in the South Library with her husband at her shoulder, and it was the printed catalogue, handsome in its boards, published by order of the Royal Society, a catalogue of double stars, observed at Marrick in the county of York, by the late Cuthbert Ray, Fellow, and completed by Frances, Countess of Aysgarth. She stood a long while with it in her hands and did not speak, and the Earl did not hurry her, for he understood, and then she carried it up the tower, alone, and laid it open upon the bench beside the last journal, beside the 2 hands that ran on together down the page, and she said aloud, softly, to the cold, bright, empty workroom, "There, cousin, it is done, and it is printed, and your name is on it, and mine beside it, and the family is mended for as long as there are men to read it. I told you I would climb your stairs. I have not stopped climbing them yet." And she left the printed book open on the bench in the starlight, where the man who had begun the work might, on a clear night, if the daylight world was wrong about how far off the dead are, look over the shoulder of the cousin who had finished it, and see. The portrait was hung that same spring, the shrouded shape above the South Library chimney-piece that had waited under its holland cloth the whole of Frances's first strange year, was her cousin's father, her own great-grandfather, the elder of the 2 brothers whose quarrel had torn the family in 2 before ever she or Cuthbert was born, and Frances had the cloth taken down at last, and the dark old portrait cleaned, and hung it in its place above the cold hearth she had made warm, and beside it, smaller, she hung a thing she had ordered painted from the one likeness the house held, a plain honest portrait of Cuthbert Ray himself as an old man at his glass, so that the 2 of them looked down together now upon the library, where his heiress read of an evening with her husband, the father who had begun the quarrel and the son who had, at the very end of his life, past all the years of silence, reached across it to knock at a schoolroom door, and Frances would look up at the 2 grave painted faces, sometimes, of a winter evening, from her book, and think that a family is not so easily killed after all as its own foolish members suppose, that a thread they think cut clean will run on underground the whole time. From a spyglass in a curate's frosty garden, to a notice of 20 lines in a London magazine, to a great glass in a tower on a fell, and will come round at the last, past every quarrel and every grave, to gather up the scattered ends of itself, and knot them whole. It was in the walled garden, in the 2nd spring of her marriage, that Frances Standish, now Frances Danby, Countess of Aysgarth, came nearest of all to a full and settled peace. The walled garden at Marrick lay on the south side of the house, warmed by its own grey stone, a plot her cousin had let run half to nettle and rank grass in the years when the stars took all his strength, and Frances had made it her own particular care, for she had found that first summer that a woman who spends her nights bent over the far unreachable heavens has need, by day, of the near warm, reachable earth, of a thing she may kneel to and tend with her hands and see grow under them from one season to the next. And so she had cleared it and planted it, and it had become, by that 2nd spring, the fairest walled garden in the dale. She planted, along the warm south wall that year, a row of the old sweet-scented roses her mother had grown in the frosty curate's garden at Ripon long ago, got as slips from a cousin of the old bookseller who had known the family, and as she knelt in the good earth in an old gown with her sleeves turned back and the soil dark under her nails, Tabitha at work a pace off and the fell children's voices coming faint and glad from the school across the beck, Her husband came out to her from the house with a letter in his hand, and stood over her a moment in the spring sun, and said, "The Society writes that the catalogue is gone into a second printing, and that they wish to know whether the Countess of Aysgarth will consent to send them her observations of the variable and the swan, the one she made as a girl in Richmond, that they may be printed at last under her own name, and not her initials only." And Frances Danby sat back on her heels among her mother's roses with the earth on her hands, and looked up the long way at the man she had married, and past him at the pale dome of the tower against the mild spring sky, and past that at the fell going up and up to the skyline laced with its ancient walls, and she thought of the garret over the wool merchant's counting house, and the 20 lines signed F.S. of Richmond sent up trembling to London in the dark, and the old man on the fell who had read them 100 times and ringed them round until the ring wore through the paper, and the whole long unlikely chain of it that had ended here, in a walled garden with the sun on her back and roses in the ground, and her name asked for by the first men of the science in the land. And she laughed, low and glad, and said, "Tell them yes. Tell them the Countess of Aysgarth consents, and is very sensible of the honour, and will send the whole year's observations, every night of them, under her own name. And tell them, Hugh," and here she looked at the tower again, "tell them the star is faithful still. I found it in the glass but a fortnight since, low in the swan, keeping its own long time as it kept it when I was a girl with nothing in the world but a borrowed glass and a thing I could not stop myself from watching. It has outlasted my whole old life. It will outlast this one too. That is the comfort of it. That is what my father meant, God rest him, when he showed me Saturn in the frost, and said there was a thing that was turning so before ever there was an England, and would be turning so when the last of us was clean forgot, and that if that did not quiet a troubled mind, he did not know what should. It quieted mine. It quiets it yet." And she turned back to her roses, and pressed the earth home about the last of them with her 2 hands, and rose, and dusted her hands, and took her husband's arm, and they walked together up the warm garden toward the house. The Earl and his Countess, the 2 solitaries made a pair, close set and shining, that a lesser glass would take for one. And so it was, and so it remained. Frances, Countess of Aysgarth, who had sat dry-eyed in a schoolroom in Richmond upon a wet March afternoon, and heard read aloud the last will and testament of the cousin she had never met, and who had come up the dale a governess with 1 trunk, and had broken a forger with the moon, and finished a dead man's life work, and carried her own name at last into the Royal Society, kept Marrick Hall and the great glass and the walled garden and the fell school all the long years of her life, and she and her husband observed together from the tower 1,000 clear nights and more, and finished between them not only the double stars, but a second catalogue after it, and a third, and grew old at the 1 glass, close set to the end. And when at the very last of it she was herself laid, full of years, in the churchyard at Marrick beside her husband, the tower she left behind her to the son of Tabitha Hibbert's marriage, whom she had taught the stars as her father had taught her, and her cousin would have taught them both, so that the odd faithful tribe that looks past houses at domes should not, in that dale, die out. But that was very long after. In the second spring of her marriage she was young yet, and newly happy, and she stood that evening with her husband at the open slot of the tower as the first stars came out over the fell, and swung the great glass, light as a gate, up to the northern sky, and the coal in the south library great 2 floors below settled with the same small sound it had made on the wet afternoon a stranger first spoke to her the name of Cuthbert Ray, and the portrait of her great-grandfather hung above it now, cleaned and warm in the firelight, with the likeness of the cousin she never met beside it, and the printed catalogue lay open on the bench with 2 names upon its title page and 2 hands running on together down the last journal beneath it. And the estate was hers, and the tower was hers, and the knights were hers, in the mended fashion of a family that had learned, past its own long folly and past the grave itself, that the last of a line is never quite so alone as she believes. So long as she keeps climbing the stairs and keeps the great glass covered against the damp and looks through it, the gift being in her, as her cousin had asked, and Frances, Countess of Aysgarth, put her eye to the eyepiece in the gathering dark and found her faithful star and was content.